We'll finish off the basics of the syntax of HTML by looking at two different types of elements which are used to mark up your document: block type and inline elements. I want to focus on the distinction between those two types of elements, and also introduce some examples of those respective types of elements. Essentially, block type elements are the ones that provide the structure to your document. They're things like headings, paragraphs, articles, sections. Those last two, incidentally, are new ones for HTML5. A key distinctive feature of the block type elements is that at the end of each of those elements it will introduce a new line. Actually, in the next slide I'll start talking a little bit about white space in HTML, because it is something which, if you're a newcomer to HTML, you need to get used to what actually happens there. So the block level elements are the ones that provide the high level structure on your documents. Inline elements, in contrast, and we've actually seen an example of that one as well in an earlier lecture, they just mark up small sections of content within a block. They're used typically to emphasize words, perhaps to identify abbreviations, certainly to provide hypertext links. And again, we'll see some more examples of those in use. So two distinct types. The basic structure of your document comes from block level elements, and then you can pick out small sections of content to highlight, emphasize, or associate hyperlinks or an explanation of an abbreviation, for example, using inline elements. But let's go back to that white space issue. The key thing about HTML, is that the block level elements are almost the only way to create a new line when HTML is rendered in the browser. Of course, there's carriage returns and so forth. But if you want to create a line break, then that occurs automatically at the end of a block level element. If you're new to HTML, you have to be aware of this. So if you write something within a paragraph where you think that the browser will respect your carriage returns at the end of the line, then you will be mistaken. So we've got a simple standard entry-level block level element, which is a paragraph here, and I've put carriage returns in my HTML markup at the end of each new line I kind of expecting to have, but actually what the browser will do is render that as a concatenation of those lines with simply a space, a single space between each of those lines. And if you use multiple spaces, again, the browser will render that as a single white space. If you use a tab, again, as in fact here, the tabs are scrubbed out and replaced with that single white line. So be aware of that. The browser is assuming that correctly, that 99 times out of 100, the formatting in terms of line breaks and white spaces and tabs and indentation and so forth is all handled in the style sheet, not in the text. However, sometimes you will want the browser to respect the white space, because in a song or a poem or a quotation quite often does have a semantic content. So there are occasions where you do want the browser to respect the white space, carriage returns and so forth, which you have, or new lines, which you have put into the text itself. If you do want to do that, then use the pre-formatted text tag, pre, and if you embed your formatted, at least formatted in terms of white space, text within pre-tags as a pre-formatted text element, then the browser will respect your choices about white space, because, as I said, if it's a song or a poem, then your choice of white space is part of the creative content, part of the semantics of that particular content. Now let's get back to the remainder of the block elements to look at some of those. So block level elements, again, as I said, these form the basic structure of your document. So if we look at a slightly expanded version of the template which we've used so far, I've put in here a lot more structure. Ignore the head because we've spoken about that at length in the last lecture. But the body has been expanded up with a number of block level elements. There are no inline elements in this bit for simplicity. But we've got a number of block level elements in here which are providing high level structure to the document. So first of all, we've got a header, and quite often the header contains some graphic to brand the website. May also, and when I come back to talk about accessibility, it should indeed contain some text. But quite often, primarily, the content of the header is a graphic, unless you've got a technical kind of document where what might be appropriate in the header is an index or a contents page. In the next chapter, we'll look at that as an example. But here, I just want to mention the header as something which is high-level branding of the website, and you could either do that graphically or you might do that with some sort of list of contents. The next thing we've got here is, again, one of the new HTML5 elements, which is to pick out a semantically coherent piece of text. We've identified the next part of the document as an article, and in that article I've split it up into sections, and within a section then I may have a level 1 heading, a level 2 heading, and some content, followed by a level 2 heading and some more content, and I might have other nested headings. So that's provided a high-level compartmentalization of my document into blocks, and those have some semantic meaning. So the notion of an article, there's an intuitive semantic meaning to that, and typically within an article one divides it up into sections, and those sections will have a heading themselves. They might also be in turn divided up into subsections with their own headings. And in fact, in this example, I could well have wrapped the content between H2 and wrapped the H2 and its respective content, its paragraphs, as a section in itself if I wanted to. If I felt it really added value to the semantics of my document. One of the features of this kind of division of responsibilities within the document, or this placing of semantics on the sections of the content or the blocks of content, is that this will often, when we come to the styling in a later course, this will quite often be reflected in the structure of the content that is actually rendered in the browser. So I've actually added a few extra bits in here to map the block level elements in a document onto a wireframe of a layout. So I've got the header again. This time I've put a nav bar, as is increasingly often used, as a horizontal nav bar underneath the header. And then I've got the article divided up into two sections, and I've also included an aside, another HTML5 new element, which is semantically associated with the article, but is indeed an aside. It's not a sidebar. That's a different kind of thing, but it's a little aside, a little bit of explanation perhaps of this specific article. And then underneath all of that, I've placed a footer, another of the HTML5 new elements. This provides a nice clear structure to the document, and as I said, what will often happen is the next step is that the designer will put together a wireframe, and the designer can map blocks on the wireframe onto semantically meaningful block level elements within your document if you use these kinds of elements sensibly. So this is how it goes. This is the beginning of the route from transitioning semantically marked up content into a design. But we'll come back to that in a later course. But I will give more material on the understanding the semantics of the various block level elements in the next chapter. The second high-level breaking up of different kinds of elements are the inline elements, and as I said, those are for picking out small elements of text which need to be distinguished in some way from the main flow of text. So we've seen an example of that already, where I used the emphasis to pull out particular new terms that I wanted to introduce in a paragraph. So new terms, tags, and elements I emphasized. And then it's the job of the stylist to make a choice about how the emphasis is actually represented in the browser. The default, of course, is that will be italicized, and if I don't do any styling, most browsers will actually italicize the emphasized elements, but your designer may have a different recommendation as to how to do that, and by simply designing simply specifying the formatting of the M inline tag in this associated style sheet, then that will be correctly reflected across all of your content. And if there is a design decision to change that, there is one place in that document where you make a modification, and that will be reflected through the rest of your website. So that is best practice in engineering websites. Let's have a look at some more of the inline elements. So interestingly, with HTML5, there are a couple there which have been deprecated, or at least discouraged with HTML 4.01, but now have been reintroduced, and I think to good effect. Those are the I and the B elements. Strong has been in use through 4.0.1, and that's something where you want to indicate the importance of the content of that inline element. But there are slightly semantically different ways of wanting to highlight parts of text. As I said, I was discouraged in 4.0.1 because it was seen as containing styling information, I representing italics. How one interprets I now, the I element now, is as a span of text that's offset for the normal prose. And in the sort of things I'm interested, a classic example of that is with plant names, where botanists and some of the more expert gardeners tend to refer to plant names with both the common name, such as rose for a rose, and a Latin name or a scientific name. The generic name for rose in Latin is very similar, rosa, R-O-S-A. But if they include both in a piece of text, what they will do is typically pick out that, usually in italics, but you might do it in a slightly different way, but that scientific name is something which is, in a sense, offset from the normal prose, because you're talking to your audience in ordinary language, and then suddenly you present a scientific name, and you want to pull that out a little bit from the normal prose and distinguish that, and the I tag inline tag wrapped around that scientific name is an appropriate way to do it. B again used to stand for bold, and again that implies a styling decision within the text. And within HTML5 that again has been brought back in, but the intent behind the B is not to impose a bold. It's merely to say we've got some text which is stylistically offset from the normal prose. So I'm using the same kind of language as I'm using, but there are some examples, a few keywords, for example, in my prose which I want to offset from the normal prose, and an example of that would be an abstract where you want to pull out a certain number of keywords, a description again where it's emphasizing some key search terms which you wrap as B elements, and then in the style sheet you'll make a decision about how those precisely are stylistically offset. The browser will by default embolden those, but in your your style sheet, it's your choice as to precisely how you represent that stylistic offset. So there are little subtleties there, and you will take a little bit of experience to get clear in your mind what the distinctions between these various inline elements are, but they are amazingly useful, and they do provide you with some extremely effective distinctions between different sections of text within a block level element. One other thing which is a good practice, and we tend not to do this, but again it's a matter of pulling out, trying to get into the practice of pulling out instead of making in your text a particular choice of how to represent things, you actually pull that out into the style sheet and make that choice as a policy on the design of the style. So here we've got one example of a short quotation where in the past one probably would have put the elements that are, the content that's within the element denoted by the Q tags within quotation marks yourself. Best practice in HTML5 is actually to identify that as an inline quote. That's a small, short quotation, and in the next chapter I'll show you how to handle block level quotes. But here, for a small quote, we've got something where there's a little bit of inline text which we want to pull out as a quotation, and we will make a choice as to how we put the quotation marks around that. And that's increasingly important because different, for example, from the point of internationalization, it's important because different languages tend to use different marks to delimit quotations. But also it's important from the accessibility point of view, because here we're making it very, very clear that this is an inline quotation. So there isn't any need for a screen reader to make an assumption when it sees a quotation mark. Here we have delimited our quotation mark completely unambiguously, and so a screen reader will see this and interpret it with confidence that we've got a piece of quoted text. So that renders in the browser by default with quotation marks around it, and as I said, you can override that default by defining your own policy on how quotes are handled within a style sheet. You might, for example, just simply italicize it. You might use different kinds of delimiters for the quotation. So that's it, as a very quick introduction to these two different kinds of elements. So those are the key things I wanted to take away from this course. This lecture, not necessarily remember which elements are which. We'll see more examples of elements, and hopefully those will get into your mind, and the potential for using these creatively will come more in the next chapter. But the key distinction is that to remember that block level elements are the ones which you use to structure your documents. They're the ones that break up the document into semantically meaningful content. Block levels elements can be nested within block level elements. So you provide substructure and substructure to that substructure and so forth as necessary. Inline elements, in contrast, are used to distinguish short sections of text in some way. We can also nest inline elements. So if you want to emphasize and emphasize something as out of the mainstream in terms of content, but also out of the mainstream in terms of styling, you could, for example, wrap an element with the B tags, and inside the content wrap that with the I tags. So you can nest inline elements. And along the way we've seen a few examples of both, but this was merely a whetter of your appetite to the sort of things you can do with these. But they're all about providing meaning to your content, and the decisions about precisely how those are represented in the browser that's rendered in the client are made in a different file to the HTML one, and to emphasize that somewhat ad nauseum, but it is important. So that's the end of this chapter. In the next chapter we're going to go into a lot more detail about the semantics of the various components of HTML, and that essentially is much more of an experience-based chapter, and we'll build up some examples to show how these kinds of elements are used, to give you some good practice. Thank you.